So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today we are going to be talking about the woman who predicted her own murder. This is the case of Jane Clough, a case that's been super requested by my channel members, so I'm finally getting around to it now. But before we get into the case, I just want to thank our sponsors for making this video possible, Karma. Karma is an app and Chrome extension that will be your new best friend while you're online shopping. You might have heard of different online shopping browser extensions before, but Karma does everything and more. You can save items from any store all in one place. You can organize them into different wish lists. Karma can send you notifications whenever those items go on sale. They can give you discount codes, cash rewards. It sounds good, doesn't it? If you want to check it out, there'll be a link down below in the description to do so. This shirt that I'm wearing right now, Karma actually helped me get a 20% discount on this. I saved it on Karma maybe about 2 weeks ago, and as soon as it went on sale, they notified me that the price had dropped, and so I swooped in there. It's super quick and simple to do. You can download Karma as an app or a Chrome plugin, and then you just head over to your favorite online shops, and whenever you click on a product, just click on the Karma button to save the item. And like I said, you can save all these items into different wish lists. So I've got one for clothes, beauty stuff, home decor items. You can make a folder for technology bits or even food purchases. Do your weekly food shop using Karma. Karma has really helped me with my impulse buying habit. I'm really bad at impulse purchases, and so I've started saving everything that I want to buy on Karma, and I just say to myself that I'll give it a week. And that way I can make sure that I really want it before I purchase it a week later. And besides, in the meantime, it's probably already gone on sale, and because it's saved on Karma, they notify me and I end up saving money on my purchases. Stuff that would have been impulse purchases in the moment, I've got for cheaper, and I'm sure that I actually want them. Karma can also automatically apply discount codes at checkout for you, so you don't even need to do that. That is a Chrome only feature, so make sure you're downloading it on your laptop or your computer, PC. You can also earn Karma Cash when buying through select retailers, which is essentially cash back, but Karma will also donate $1 to charity for every $50 that you spend, which is amazing. So if you do want to download Karma for free, do it. It's linked down below in the description. Go get it. Start saving with your online shopping today. Thanks again to Karma for sponsoring this video. Now, before we get into this case, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. Just a couple of content warnings before we get into this one. This case does involve domestic abuse, very strong and constant themes of domestic abuse, sexual assault, rape, sexual abuse. It is a really heavy case, so if you don't think you want to watch any of that right now, feel free to click out of this video. Please look after yourself. I'm sure I'll see you again sometime soon with a case that's maybe a little bit more suitable for you. Anyway, all that being said, let's just get into the case. So Jane Clough was a 26-year-old woman originally born and raised in Nelson in Lancashire, which is in the north of England. She was her parents' first child. Her parents' names were Penny and John Clough, and they were just besotted by their beautiful baby girl. They thought she was the most beautiful thing in the whole world. With her big brown eyes, she was a really cute kid. And as she grew older and obviously developed her own personality and everything, she just grew into such an amazing little girl. She was loving, nurturing, she was kind, caring, considerate. Her parents were just so proud watching her grow up, watching her grow into this wonderful, amazing woman. She had so much to give the world, so many talents, so many ideas. She was super intelligent and very hardworking, so you can imagine she did really well in school. She was very academic. She got very good grades. When she started learning to drive as well, she picked that up really easily. I think she was just a really good learner. Overall, Jane Clough just had a very normal and happy life. She was just like any other young girl her age. She had a great group of friends. She had boyfriends here and there growing up. She would go on nights out. She was very social. She was just really good fun to be around. And because she was just so nice and kind, she wasn't a mean person in any way. So everyone loved her. She was popular. People loved being around her. People loved inviting her out places. Jane was very, very ambitious. She knew what she wanted from the world and she knew how to get those things. She was so hardworking, I've already said that, but she really was. Like, she knew from a very, very young age that she always wanted a job in helping people, because that's just the kind of person she was. She was very nurturing, very caring. Her mother, Penny, was a nurse, so that's probably where she got this from. She will have watched her mum get ready for work every single day, go into work to go and help and save people. And Jane looked up to her mother so much, and she knew that when she was older, she wanted to be a nurse, just like her mother. She knew that it was going to require a lot of hard work and a lot of studying, but she was willing to do it. So Jane did all of the studies that she needed to do. She picked her A-levels accordingly. She went off to university, medical courses, degrees, all of that. She passed them all with flying colours, and then in 2007, when she was 22 years old, she was officially qualified to become a nurse. And she quickly found the perfect entry job for her at the urgent care unit of Blackpool's Victoria Hospital. Jane made a bunch of new friends at this new job. As I'm sure you can imagine, they all shared a lot of the same passions and interests because, I mean, they'd all chosen to become nurses for a reason. They all wanted to help people just as much as Jane did, and they all thought Jane was amazing at what she did. She was a really good nurse. She was really good with people, really social. She was good at comforting people on the job. Everyone always looked up to Jane as an example of what, like, the perfect nurse is. Not even just with patients, but also with co-workers. She always made everyone smile, made everyone laugh, which, let's be honest, in a hospital when your job is caring for poorly and dying people, it can be quite hard to keep a smile on your face through the day, but Jane did it and she kept people up with her. So Jane's settling into her new job really well. She really enjoys it. And then after a few months of being there, this man gets hired and joins her team. His name was Jonathan Vass. He was a few years older than Jane was. He was an ambulance technician and Jane kind of liked him. Jonathan Vass was 27 years old. He was originally from Luton in the south of England, but when he was just a few years old, him and his whole family moved up to Lancashire, which is where Jane lived. So Jane met Jonathan at work and immediately she felt as though they had a lot in common. So Jane felt that her and Jonathan would probably get on really well because they both have this passion for nurturing people and caring for people. So as the weeks went by, whenever Jane would pass Jonathan in the corridors or whatever, she would give him a smile or say hi or strike up a conversation, and eventually it was clear that Jonathan was starting to like Jane too. He would pick her out of a crowd to go and speak to her rather than the other nurses. And as Jane got to know Jonathan more and more, she realised that this man just was perfect for her. He was funny, jokey, light-hearted, just the way that she was, trying to make everyone's day a little bit brighter and a little bit easier. He was just super smiley and positive, and they were a perfect match in her eyes. Outside of work at the hospital, Jonathan Vass was a proper lad's lad. I'm sorry, I hate to use that kind of terminology in a true crime video, but there's really no other better way to explain what this man was like. Pints, pub, football, gym. He really liked the gym. He was very much into like bodybuilding and weightlifting and building this perfect physique. I think he took steroids as part of it because actually he also had a part-time job as a bouncer at a nightclub, so he did need to be like big and strong to be able to have this other job. That was like his side passion. He had his main passion, which was his work and helping people and, you know, all the ambulance work that he did, but his other passion was bodybuilding. And Jane liked all these different things about him. She liked that he was really manly, but he also had this kind of soft side at the hospital. Like, He was perfect for her. Everything about him just interested and attracted Jane Clough towards him, and after a while, Jonathan finally plucked up the courage to ask Jane out on a date. Of course, Jane jumped at the chance to go on this date, and from this point on, they were kind of unofficially seeing each other. So they weren't officially like boyfriend and girlfriend, officially in a relationship, but they were a thing, and they decided to keep this thing under wraps from their co-workers because Jonathan Vass was quite a private man and he didn't want to just go and blurt it to all his new co-workers that he was seeing one of the nurses. So they kept it to themselves for about 4 months that they were seeing each other and like sneaking off to go and have a coffee with each other on their breaks so that no one would know. But finally, when Jane did tell all of her friends that she was seeing the new ambulance technician Jonathan Vass, they weren't quite as excited about it as she'd thought they were going to be. In fact, they were quite negative about the whole thing, and Jane couldn't understand why. She was so happy with this man and she thought all her friends liked him and she thought they would be happy for her. But it seemed that Jane's friends knew Jonathan in a completely different way than she did. They saw this man completely differently. They all said that he was weird, he was unprofessional, inappropriate, he would drop inappropriate jokes when, let's be honest, they're in a hospital. It needs to be a very formal, professional setting. Jane was good at knowing when to joke and what to joke about, but Jonathan wasn't. He was clumsy, he was awkward, he was lazy, he was bad at his job, and Jane saw none of this in him. I mean, you can tell from the way that I've described him that Jane saw him as this perfect man, but all of her friends saw a completely different person when they looked at him. So Jane was a little bit confused by this, but she didn't let it affect anything. She thought, well, maybe I just know him on a deeper level than they do. Maybe he's just misunderstood to them. They've caught him on a bad day or something, and then they've formulated those opinions on a bad day. She knew the Jonathan that she was going on dates with, and it wasn't like what her friends were describing. So, I mean, if she was happy, then she was going to continue. So Jane's friends and family watched her fall further and further in love with this man, and she was so happy. It was like she'd found her fairy tale. They would meet up for lunch together at work, he would take her out for coffees on the weekends, take her to bars. Everything was just so nice. And then about 4 months into the relationship, Jonathan finally asked Jane Clough to be his girlfriend. So they were official. But it was when Jonathan asked her this question, if she wanted to be his girlfriend, that he also dropped another bombshell. Jonathan Vass actually told Jane Clough that he was married. He had been married for about 2 years. He had a whole other life at home versus when he was at work with Jane. He had a whole wife at home and a whole girlfriend at work, and neither of them knew about each other. Well, until now. But it didn't even stop there. That wasn't even the extent of it. Not only did he have a wife at home, he also had 2 children. And these children were young as well. They were like under 5 years old. 2 babies at home. So obviously as soon as Jane heard this, she was so shocked. She was so disappointed. She was heartbroken. All these different emotions. I can't imagine how it must feel to have the person that you're in love with tell you that they have a whole other life that you had no idea about. But Jonathan quickly tried to tell her that, look, it's not what it sounds like. It turned out there was a lot more to it than just, oh, double life, wife at home, girlfriend at work, because he was actually trying to leave his wife. They were trying to get a divorce because he told Jane that his wife had cheated on him multiple times. He said they were technically informally split up, like they'd split up, but they just had that binding legal marriage. So they were going through the steps of the divorce, and because they had these 2 kids, like it was all really complicated, so they hadn't tried to rush it for the kids' sake. And when he explained the context behind it, Jane was a lot more comfortable. She understood that it was very complicated. She understood that there was a lot at stake, 2 young kids, and so she was like, okay, as long as you're getting it sorted, then we're fine to continue this. So Jane stuck by him, continued the relationship. If anything, she felt sorry for Jonathan for being stuck in this situation with a wife that's been cheating on him, and now he's got to go back and sleep in the same bed as her and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, she trusted that all of that would be over really quickly, and so they continued their relationship as though they were just any normal couple. Jane introduced Jonathan Vass to her parents, who really liked him. He settled into Jane's life really, really well, really easily, and then about 10 months into their relationship, Jonathan finalised his divorce against his wife. And so he and Jane decided to take the next step in their relationship, and they moved in together in 2008. And Jane was so happy. But what she didn't realise was that Jonathan was lying to her. He hadn't finalised the divorce. Actually, there wasn't a divorce at all. He wasn't getting a divorce. His wife hadn't cheated on him. He was, in fact, living that double life. He was still happily married to her, and his wife had no idea that Jane existed. He was still going home to his kids every day. He would make up fake night shifts at the hospital and different errands that he had to run so that he would have an excuse to leave Jane and go to his wife's house, his family home, and go and sleep in the same bed as his wife while Jane thinks he's working at the hospital. He would just flick from one family to the other pretty much on a daily basis. I don't know how this man was not completely exhausted all the time. And Jane just had no idea that this was going on. But as time went by, it was actually Jane's parents that started to notice some little red flags about Jonathan Vass. They noticed that Jonathan would tell a lot of pointless little white lies in conversation. And this is one of my biggest pet peeves ever. People that lie about tiny little things that don't even add to the conversation. These lies are nothing major, nothing that would ever cause problems, I suppose, but just little things, like he would lie about his grandmother being a millionaire. He said that his grandmother lived in London, she owned a house on Baker Street, and she was going to leave this house for him in her will. Turns out he never had a millionaire grandma. His grandma did not live in London. She didn't own a house. Why would you need to lie about that? I don't know. And Jane's parents immediately thought, well, that's weird. If your grandmother is a millionaire and she's going to leave this house to you in her will anyway, then why is she letting you struggle financially up in Lancashire? Jonathan Vass did have some money struggles. He had 2 jobs, but I think the reason he had 2 jobs was because he was in a lot of debt. So he didn't even see most of those 2 wages because they were going into paying off his debt. He had maxed out credit cards, he had a mortgage on his house, like he owed a lot of money. And Jane's parents were just thinking, why is your grandma a millionaire and letting you suffer? Why can't she pay off like a few grand of your debt if she's rich enough to live on Baker Street in London? But they kind of explained it away as like, oh, well, maybe he was just desperately trying to get us to like him, because at the end of the day, they were his girlfriend's parents, and maybe he did just want to make a good impression and he just did it in a bad way. But it wasn't just Jane's parents or Jane that he would lie to. He would lie to everyone in his life. Like men down at the pub, he would lie about what his job was. He would lie about how much money he earned. So that was the first red flag that people started seeing in Jonathan. And then the second followed up very quickly after, because he started getting quite controlling of Jane. He would text her and call her at all hours of the day, no matter where she was, no matter what she was doing. He wanted to know, well, where she was and what she was doing, who she was with. Jane didn't really see this as much of an issue. I think she was quite oblivious to his reasoning behind it. I think she saw it as just like a genuine interest in her day and her life, and oh, it's just my boyfriend checking up on me. But her family saw through it. They saw that he was just doing it because he needed that control over Jane. He wanted to know what she was doing. He wanted to know that she wasn't going out and talking to boys and stuff. But Jane saw Jonathan Vass in this golden light that couldn't be broken. This was the perfect man for her. She couldn't be shown this dark side that everyone else saw. In fact, she liked him so much that she was pretty certain that this was it for her. This was the man that she was going to spend the rest of her life with. He was going to be her husband one day. He was going to be the father of her children one day. But things only got worse and worse in their relationship, and it was a very gradual decline as well. Things started off really well for them, and then very slowly things started to change to the point where Jane couldn't see it, but everyone else could. Now, he wasn't just lying and controlling. He was actually intentionally trying to break down Jane's self-esteem. He would throw into conversation little sly comments about how stupid she was, about how she looked bad, just little things to put her down and make her feel insecure. He would even do it in front of other people. So like when they got to work, he would mention to one of their mutual co-workers that Jane had had a go at him and shouted at him that morning. Like, he's trying to make Jane look bad to her co-workers. Is he trying to turn them against her? Is he trying to make people not really want to hang out with Jane? Is he trying to isolate her and keep her away from her friends? And he actually even tried using this technique on Jane's own parents. Like, he would go around to her parents' house when she wasn't even there, and he would tell them all of her secrets, like all the kind of stuff that you probably don't want your parents to know. He was just humiliating her for no reason. Like, he wasn't allowing her any privacy or control of her own secrets or anything like that. Meanwhile, the controlling aspects of the relationship were only getting worse and worse with time as well. At first it was just calls and texts, and now Jonathan was actually physically stalking his girlfriend. He would follow Jane around in his car. Like, he would drive behind her car to make sure that she was going wherever she said that she was going to be. So for example, there was this one time where she was going out for lunch with all of her co-workers, and she told him that she was, but he didn't believe her. And so he got in his car, and Jane, from inside this restaurant, she was watching out of the window, she saw Jonathan's car pull onto the street, he was looking through the window, and then he left. He was checking on her. I don't know if Jane's friends, co-workers, or even her family knew that this was going on, that he was like physically stalking her and following her. Because in fact, there was a lot of stuff that Jane wasn't telling people. There was a lot of stuff that she was purposefully hiding about her relationship. One of the biggest things that Jane was hiding from everyone was the fact that ever since Jonathan had moved in with her, ever since they started living together, he had started physically abusing her. It started out when they would have an argument and he would just slap her around the face. Like, he would just do it once, and she didn't like it, obviously, but she thought, well, maybe I deserve it, or maybe I did something to provoke it. But it only got increasingly worse from there, to the point where he was grabbing her, pushing her, throwing her into walls. He would punch her in the face. And I think this was going on for some months before anyone even found out. The way that people did find out was one of Jane's co-workers actually noticed some bruising on the side of her neck. Well, actually, they noticed that Jane had been wearing scarves to work quite a lot, which is not a usual thing when you're a nurse, so obviously people noticed. And so Jane took this co-worker that noticed the bruises to the side, and she told them everything that was going on at home. She even showed them some more bruises. She lifted up her hair, and they were like all behind her ear, they were all the way down her neck, all across her chest and her shoulders. And her friend was absolutely horrified to hear that Jane was going through all of this at home, but she did say that she actually wasn't surprised. Because remember, Jane's co-workers, Jane's friends at work, had seen the real Jonathan this whole time. They saw him for what he truly was. He was unprofessional, inappropriate, weird, awkward, rude. And they'd also noticed just how much this relationship had changed Jane for the worse. This once very bright, bubbly, fun, positive girl at work had now turned into a very quiet and reserved and quite miserable, unenthusiastic, tired person that they didn't know. They didn't know Jane anymore. They could see glimmers of her old personality coming through every now and again, but this new Jane was nothing like the one that they'd first met. And of course, people told her to leave him this whole time. People had always been telling Jane, you've got to get away from him, you've got to leave him, he is not for you. But Jane just couldn't bring herself to admit that he had changed. Well, actually, I don't think it was a case of him changing. I think he'd always been like that. He just put on this different character for Jane when they first met. He wanted to charm her. He wanted to, make her like him, so that once she was comfortable in this relationship and once they were official and once he'd tied her down, then he could take this mask off and be the real horrible, evil person that he was. And Jane didn't want to leave him because she did love him. She did have love for this man, but it wasn't the man that he was now. It was the man that she'd first met. It was that really fun, charming guy that used to take her out for coffees on her lunch break. She loved him. She loved that character that he put on in the beginning, and she was so desperate to try to get that Jonathan back that she wouldn't leave him. She thought that with time, he might get there again. She knew that he was going through a lot right now with the divorce and his kids and everything like that. Of course, none of that was actually going on. But Jane made a lot of excuses for him. She thought that one day he was going to be the old Jonathan again. And then, in January of 2009, something very unexpected happened. Jane Clough fell pregnant with Jonathan's baby. And this pregnancy was met with very mixed emotions from everyone. Jane herself was happy. She'd always wanted a baby, and she knew she wanted one with Jonathan as well. Like I said, she wanted to marry him and she wanted to have children with him. But ever since he'd become abusive, she was now anxious about having this child around him. But she also hoped that maybe this could be the thing to stop the abuse. Maybe this could change him. Maybe this could be what they need to turn him back into the old Jonathan. Because if she was pregnant, maybe he wouldn't hit her, because maybe he would be protective over the baby that is literally inside her. Or maybe once the baby arrived, he would settle down and he would become this loving, nurturing, fatherly figure that she thought he was capable of being. It was just a lot of wishful thinking, Jane thinking that he could change for this baby. And Jane's parents were quite frankly terrified at this news, which is so sad that they heard that they were about to have their first ever grandchild and they can't even be happy about that. That's supposed to be like the best news in the world, to hear that you're getting a grandchild. But they can't be happy because they weren't confident that Jane or the baby would be safe. They hated the idea of Jane being tied to this man. If she had this baby to him, he would have so many rights, being able to see her and the baby. It would be so much harder for her to get out of this abusive relationship if there was a child involved now. And they just knew that Jonathan would use this baby against Jane. He would use the baby as a weapon somehow. They didn't know how he was going to do it, but they knew that that was the kind of thing he would do. And if he was capable of abusing Jane the way that he was, would he also abuse this baby? But even though Jane's parents felt this way, they still tried to be as supportive as they possibly could for Jane, because that was one thing that they always made sure she knew. She could do whatever she wanted with her life. If she so wanted to be with this abusive partner, they weren't going to physically intervene and pull her away from him, because at the end of the day, she is a fully grown woman and she has the right to make those decisions. But her parents did make sure that Jane knew that no matter what happened, no matter what choices she chose in life, no matter what path she chose, they were always going to be there with their arms wide open. If anything ever went wrong, she could run back to them and everything would be safe, no questions asked. They would look after her and make sure she was okay, no matter what. They let her know that if she wanted to go ahead and have this baby, then she could. That was her choice. And if she ever needed her parents, they were there. She could run to their house, she could take the baby to their house, she could go to them for a safe space from whatever goes on in her life. And things did start to go wrong in her life before the baby was even born yet. When Jane Clough was around 7 months pregnant, Jonathan Vass somehow stepped up his horrible abuse a whole other level. This time, he demanded sex from Jane Clough, and when she turned him down, she said she didn't feel like it that night. He forced her into it anyway. And he'd never done this before. Through their whole relationship, Jane had actually felt quite respected in that way, that if she didn't want to do anything, she didn't have to do it. But now, her boyfriend, the father of her soon-to-be child, just raped her. And she felt just so shocked and violated and heartbroken. Like, I can't imagine how awful that must feel. Especially the fact that she is 7 months pregnant and the man who put that baby inside her doesn't even value her as a human being. All he sees her as is an object to sleep with whenever he wants. Doesn't matter whether she wants it or not. If he wants it, he'll get it. And this wasn't just a one-time thing either. I mean, he did it that first time, and I think something must have clicked in his brain. He realized that, oh, if I want sex, I can literally just go and get it from her. He realized that there was nothing physically stopping him other than consent, but there was no physical thing getting in his way of him raping his girlfriend. And so he continued to do it repeatedly for weeks and weeks until their baby was eventually born. Jane gave birth to a beautiful baby girl in October of 2009, and for a short while after the birth, all of the abuse just stopped. And Jane was really hopeful that maybe this was it. Maybe this is what it took, was a baby. And now their past was behind them, it was all over, and they could move on and be a happy family. But, of course, that's not what happened. 6 weeks after the birth of their baby girl, Jonathan Vass raped Jane Clough once again. This was the 8th time he'd done this. And this time, it was even worse because it was right in front of their newborn baby. The baby was literally laying in a crib right next to this. And it was this particular time that made Jane realise that she couldn't do this anymore. It was no longer just affecting her. She wasn't the only victim. It was now affecting her baby. And she wasn't going to let any harm come to her baby daughter. She knew that she needed to get out of this relationship desperately. And so one day when Jonathan was at work, or maybe he was out with his other wife, who knows, but he told Jane that he was at work. And so she ran around the whole house and packed bags full of her stuff, full of the baby's stuff. She grabbed her daughter and ran. And she left. She left the house that she had with Jonathan. She went back to her parents' house and she asked if she could stay with them for a while, which of course they let her. And Jane's parents, by the way, at this point in the case, they had no idea about most of the stuff that was going on in the relationship behind closed doors. I don't think they knew he was physically abusing her. They definitely didn't know that he was raping her. I think all they really knew about was the emotional manipulation and stuff like that, like him texting her all the time and calling her and controlling her. I don't think they realised it had gotten abusive. Like physically abusive. And so Jane, as soon as she moved her and her child into her parents' house, she sat both her mother and her father down and she told them everything. Well, almost everything. She showed them her bruises, she told them exactly what he was like, but the only thing that she actually kept from her parents was the sexual abuse. I don't know why she didn't tell them that part, but I understand. Like, you know, maybe she just didn't want to say it out loud. She didn't want to admit it to her parents. Maybe she didn't want to worry her parents. But she was revealing so many different things to them that they'd been completely unaware of this whole time. Things like he used to literally take Jane's phone off of her like she was a child. So then that way she couldn't text or speak to anyone. And so when they wouldn't hear from her for about 3 days in a row, that was why. There were days that he would literally lock her in the apartment while he went to work or while he went to go and see his other wife. Her parents, upon hearing all of this, they tried once again to encourage Jane to finally just leave him. They knew it wasn't going to be easy for her, especially now that she had this child, but they were willing to support her. They were willing to help her and encourage her. But there was nothing that they could really do. They couldn't literally pick her up and move her into a different house. They couldn't stop them from seeing each other at work, all these different kind of things. It had to be Jane that made these changes in her life, and I just don't think she was at a point where she felt like she could. Anyway, at this point in the case, she'd been at her parents' house for about 3 days, and her and the baby were settling in, everything was calming down, and then out of nowhere, Jane receives a text from Jonathan. And this text was so eerie. All it said was, "We are staying together regardless of our problems." That's literally him reaching out to Jane after not seeing her for 3 days just to be like, "Oh, by the way, you can't escape me. There's no way out. We're going to be together forever. You're stuck with me. So Jane very calmly responded to this text saying, I love you, Johnny, but I don't feel safe with you anymore. Which I think says a lot about Jane Clough. This woman has been to hell and back with this man, but even still, her texts to her abuser are polite. She's reminding him that she loves him. She's just such a kind soul. Jonathan replied to that text saying, I love you too, but why run to your parents? I'm not going to kill you or batter you. For days and days and days, Jonathan continued to call and text Jane, just begging her to come back. He was apologising. He was saying, just come back to the house and we can start over. And Jane said, okay, I'll come back, but only if you promise to get professional help. Like, go to the doctors and get some kind of assessment, like a mental health assessment. He promised her that he would. In fact, he said that he already had. He said he'd been to the GP like 3 days earlier, and so everything was already in the process of going somewhere. And Jane believed him, and so she actually took him back. She got the baby, got all her stuff, and she moved back into the house with him. And she really believed that things could change this time. She really did. She thought that if he was getting professional help, like being seen by an actual psychiatrist, maybe getting some medication, things could be better. But it was only 3 days into moving back in with Jonathan that facade was broken. All it took was 3 days back together, and he raped Jane once again. Now, this time was different for Jane. She realised that this was the absolute final straw. She had tried to leave him plenty of times before, but this time she was leaving him and she was never going back. He had just proven that he cannot change and will not change. He has refusal to change. And so once again, the next time that Jonathan left the house for work, Jane packed up all the bags, got the baby, and went back to her parents' house a second time. And once again, her parents, they were amazing with her. They welcomed her and the baby, and they begged and begged and begged her to finally this time just go to the police about Jonathan Vass, just report him for everything that he's doing to you. And finally, Jane was ready to do that. This whole time she hadn't been ready. She hadn't wanted to do that to him because she really saw the good in him this whole time. But now all of that was gone for her. All she saw him as was her abuser. He was no longer her boyfriend. He was no longer the amazing Jonathan from work that she met like a year ago. He was a horrible man. And so she went down to the police station and filed a report detailing everything he'd ever done to her, all the abuse, all of the times he raped her. This report included pictures of all of the bruises on her body. They got statements from her family, her friends. So immediately, police go out and they arrest Jonathan Vass. They bring him back to the police station where they put him in an interview room. And of course, he denies everything. He actually told the police that Jane was a liar. She was an attention seeker. She was just trying to make him look bad. She was just trying to ruin his life with these allegations. But police believed Jane. I mean, they'd literally seen the bruises all over her body. How can you deny the bruises? They knew deep down that Jane was telling the truth, but for the law's sake, obviously when someone is accused of fabricating claims, that does need to be looked into. And so they called Jane into the police station and they interviewed her a bunch of times over a number of weeks, basically just asking for her to run through the stories again and again and again, which must have been awful for her. But the reason they do this is that if she was lying, then there would be differences in these stories. They'd be able to pick out bits that she forgot or bits that she told differently as time went on. But nothing changed because she was telling the truth. She was telling the exact same stories every single time, and police were confident that she was telling the truth, that this was a genuine victim. So following this, in November of 2009, Jonathan Vass was charged with raping and assaulting his girlfriend, Jane Clough. And as soon as this happened, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Jonathan was going to be sent to a holding cell, so he was going to be away from Jane and the baby. He could no longer cause issues If he was locked away in a holding cell, he wasn't around to make Jane's life miserable. And Jane's life was becoming more peaceful by the day. Like, her and her daughter were finally able to settle and just feel relaxed and safe and comfortable. And Jane's life slowly started to go back to normal. I mean, obviously she had to be off of work to go and have her daughter. She was on maternity leave, and so it was around this time that she started integrating back into work. She decided to slowly phase back in, so she started back part-time. I think she was just doing 2 night shifts a week because it was easier for childcare and stuff. Her parents could look after her daughter during the night while Jane was at work. And Jane was happy to be back. She was happy to see all her friends, all her co-workers, and they were happy to see Jane back. But all of this happiness and relief and peace was not gonna last very long, because like I said, Jonathan Vass had only been put in a holding cell. He was awaiting his trial, so he hadn't actually been sentenced just yet. And when you're just in a holding cell, nothing is confirmed. You're not officially a criminal, you're not officially guilty, and so you can actually apply for bail, which is where you are still technically awaiting trial, but you don't have to be in a cell. So he applied for bail twice, which if he was granted it, it would mean that he was just back out walking the streets. So he applied for bail twice and it was rejected twice. And then eventually he applied a 3rd time, and Jane's family were anxious every single time he applied because every single time there was the chance that he would be back out in the world. But Jane's family's legal team basically told them, look, don't worry, he can only apply for bail a maximum of 3 times, and this is his 3rd chance. If he doesn't get let out this time, then he's not going to get let out at all. He's going to be in there up until his trial. And they basically said, look, the chances of him actually being granted bail are very, very low because, look, I mean, he's already tried twice, and twice they've said no. So everyone was quite confident that it was just going to get rejected, just like his other 2, but they were wrong. After 2 months in a holding cell, Jonathan Vass was released on bail. He was still awaiting his trial, but for now, until then, he was back out in the world. He was walking the same streets that Jane and her baby were. They decided it would be a good idea to let out this horribly abusive man. Luckily, when he was arrested and charged with assault and with rape, he was fired from his job at the hospital, so at least Jane didn't have to see him at work. Oh, and one other thing that had happened, obviously he'd been in this holding cell for like a month, and there's no way that he could hide or explain that to his wife and his kids, because remember, he was still living this double life somehow. How are you going to explain that you can't see them for a full month because you're in prison? I mean, so this was how his wife actually found out about Jane and her husband's other baby to this other woman. She found out about everything. And so she actually threw him out of the house because she was also a victim of this man. This man had been awful to both women, Jane and this wife, and his kids, all 3 that he now had. So he was kicked out, so he couldn't go back and live with his other family and pretend like everything was okay. Literally everything was falling down around Jonathan Vass. Both of his lives that he'd built up were now ruined. He didn't have either of his girlfriends. He didn't have any of his children. Actually, his wife did, for some reason, allow him access to her children. Like, she allowed him to keep seeing his other 2 kids. I don't know if she quite realised the violence that he was capable of. I don't know if he abused her through their marriage or if it was just Jane. But I don't know, for some reason she still let her babies around him. But yeah, Jonathan Vass was now out on bail, which makes me absolutely seething. Like, as I've been doing this job, I have seen some absolutely awful decisions get made in different true crime cases, but this decision to let Jonathan Vass out on bail is one of the most stupid decisions I've ever seen anyone make. I really hope, and I don't say this kind of stuff a lot because it's really negative, but I really hope that the judge that granted him bail was fired. I really hope that that judge is no longer a judge, because if they're making decisions like that are literally putting people's lives at risk, then they shouldn't be a judge. Because there was obviously no way that this man was going to stick to the conditions of his bail. Obviously, because he had committed a sexual crime, there were certain things that he couldn't do. He couldn't go anywhere near Jane. He wasn't allowed anywhere near her baby. But of course, he was going to go and try and find her. Jane knew it. Her whole family knew it. Everyone that knew Jonathan knew that he was going to do this. But they didn't know when. It was just a matter of time. When was he gonna do it? When was he gonna come and find Jane? So in an attempt to try and protect Jane as much as they possibly could, her family got double, triple locks put on both their front door and their back door. Jane never went anywhere alone. If she wanted to go to a shop, someone had to escort her literally to and from her car, around the shop. No one ever left her alone for too long. Whenever she would go to work, she would drive there, and then one of her co-workers would literally come out of the building, come and meet her at her car in the car park, and then they would walk together into the building, because even just between her car and the hospital, a 200-meter walk, if that, something could have happened to her. Jonathan could have been there. For a long, long time, the Clough family lived in constant anxiety, knowing that Jonathan was going to come back for Jane one day, but they just didn't know when. Around this time in the case, Jane actually started keeping a diary, and I've got some quotes from that diary. She wrote, "I can't help thinking he'll get his revenge on me." 2 weeks later, she followed up with, "When is this hell going to end? I know some people think I'm overreacting. They say if Johnny was going to break bail, he would have done it already. But I don't believe that. I'm scared." A month after that, in February of 2010, she wrote, "What is his plan? What is he going to do? I don't think we'll get to go to trial without him doing something to hurt me in some way. I don't think we've seen the last of him." And just a month after that, in March, she wrote, "I've been worrying today about Johnny coming to get me, even killing me. What would stop him?" You can see this continuing terror in Jane's mind for months. It's dragging on for months. These diary entries were over the span of like 4, 5, even 6 months. She is thinking every second of every day that he could come and get her any minute now. It must have been absolutely agonizing for this woman to live through this. And the trial wasn't going to be for another half a year at least. From this point, his trial was set for October of 2010 because he actually pled not guilty to the charges. So she was going to have to wait until October to get a sentencing for him. And at this point, as she's writing these things, like, I think he's going to kill me, it's March. And she has to wait until October. In May, Jane Clough went down to the police station to go and write up a formal victim's statement thing. This was going to be the official document that was going to be used against Jonathan Vass in court. It had to detail absolutely everything he'd ever done to her. She was accusing him of 9 counts of rape and an uncountable amount of physical assaults. And because she was the only victim in this, well, the only direct victim, it would have to be her that went to the court and stood in front of Jonathan Vass. She needed to stand there and testify against him and answer a load of questions and relive this. And as traumatic as that was going to be for her, she was so willing to do it. She was more than willing to do it if it meant that her and her daughter would be safe and peaceful for the whole time that he was in jail. So Jane gave this official statement to the police, and she said that she was going to testify in court and whatever. And then police / Jonathan's lawyers, I don't know who exactly did this, but one of them made the absolutely dreadful and dangerous decision to inform Jonathan Vass, who, by the way, remember, is out on the streets, walking free this whole time. They decided to tell him that Jane was going to testify against him in court. And I don't know whose decision this was, because it's literally almost just as bad as the guy that let him out on bail, because this just provoked Jonathan. This just made him think, I can't let Jane do that. I'm going to have to stop Jane from testifying against me in court. In his eyes, all of this was Jane's fault. Absolutely everything. The fact that he was going to jail, the fact that he lost his job. She was the reason that he was facing time in prison as a rapist. He saw all of this as her fault, not his actions and their consequences. He just thought that she was to blame for everything that was going wrong in his life right now. And he knew that he had to do something about this. And so he decided that he was going to break the terms of his bail. He started just by online stalking Jane. So he wasn't actually allowed to go on her Facebook or anything like that as part of his bail, but he broke it anyway. And he would obsessively read everything she put on Facebook, all of her statuses, all of her comments on other people's things, because he was desperately trying to figure out what she was doing. He was no longer allowed to text and call her, asking where she was, who she was with, what she was doing, so he had to do it this way. And over time, as he was stalking her more and more and more, he actually managed to work out her schedule. He managed to figure out when she was in work, what time she normally left work, what time she normally woke up in the morning, where the baby was. And as soon as he knew where she was going to be at what times of her day, this stalking went from online stalking to in person. Obviously, because he'd been thrown out of his wife's house and he was no longer allowed to live in the house that he shared with Jane, he actually went back and started living with his parents, which was about 50 miles away from where Jane lived. But every single day, Jonathan Vass would drive the 50 miles from his parents' house to Jane's parents' house so that he could watch Jane leave her parents' house, get into her car, and then he would follow her on the roads all the way to work, and then he would watch her get out of her car at work and walk into work. This whole time, by the way, she was completely unaware. I don't know how this man is so good at stalking and going undetected, especially when she knows what car he drives. But somehow, he was always there. He was always stalking her, always following her, and she never once caught on. And because she was so unaware that all of this was going on, Jane was feeling more and more confident, more and more safe every single day, and she actually started to let her guard down. She didn't feel as though she needed protecting by everyone else as much as she used to. She decided that she probably no longer needed an escort everywhere that she went. She didn't need walking to and from her car. She didn't need walking to and from work. She even decided to go on her first night out in years on July 23rd, 2010. And this was the first night she'd seen her co-workers outside of work since before she got with Jonathan. They all met up and they went to a bar together and they just had the best time. All of her friends said that it was so nice to see Jane like this again. She was smiling, she was dancing, she was singing. They had a great night out at this bar, and then they all went back to one of the girls' houses for a sleepover. Then in the morning they all went for breakfast. They made it this big thing. And then the next morning, one of her friends went and dropped Jane off at her house and she was safe. And all of her friends were so hopeful seeing Jane like this. They really believed that they were going to be getting the old Jane back. That girl with a spark, that girl with the bright smile, she was coming back. But little did her friends know that this was going to be the last time they would ever see Jane Clough alive. Just 2 days later, on Sunday, July 25th, 2010, Jane Clough got in her car and drove to work at the hospital. She was going to start her usual night shift. And like I said, by this point, Jane was a lot more confident. She felt a lot more safe and she no longer needed someone to walk her to and from work. So she would park up her car and she would walk from the car park to the front entrance of the building by herself now. So on this day, she did exactly that. She went and parked her car in the staff car park. It was around 8 p.m, just after 8 p.m. She gets out of her car and starts walking towards the hospital, completely unaware that Jonathan Vass is also there at the hospital, waiting for her. He'd been waiting there for almost an hour for Jane to get to work. He'd thought ahead and decided to actually hide his car a few hundred meters away, park it somewhere else so that she wouldn't see his car on the way in. So he'd parked further away and then he got his bike out of the boot of his car and then rode his bike to the hospital. And then he'd been hiding down the side of one of the cars in the hospital car park for almost an hour, waiting for Jane to arrive, and now she finally had. He watched as Jane got out of her car, locked the door behind her, and started walking towards the hospital. He laid in wait until suddenly he jumped out of this hiding spot and confronted Jane. He demanded that Jane drop the charges against him, that she doesn't testify against him in court, that she just drops this and moves on with her life. And I can't imagine how horrifying this must have been for Jane to see him, to know that he has come back for her. But she stood her ground. She refused to drop the charges, and she tried to get away from Jonathan Vass as quickly as she possibly could. She didn't believe that he'd just come here just to tell her that. She knew that there was more coming, and so she tried to get away. But before she could escape, Jonathan grabbed her and pulled a knife out of his pocket and raised it up by Jane's face. And immediately she knew what was about to happen. Jonathan plunged the blade into Jane's torso over and over and over again, stabbing her all over her body. He was going for a while. He got her down onto the floor. He was stabbing her repeatedly. And then finally, when he felt satisfied, he got up, turned around, walked back over to where he'd left his bike, and he was just going to leave. But at this point, he hadn't realised that Jane was actually still alive. He'd stabbed her so many times that he thought there was no way she could have still been alive. But as he turned round, just before he got on his bike, he turned round to check Jane's body on the ground one last time. And when he looked, she wasn't there. Jane had somehow found the energy to pick herself up, and she was dragging herself towards her car. As soon as Jonathan saw that, he knew that he could not let Jane survive this attack, and so he dashed back over to her to finish her off. He pushed her back down onto the ground, pulled the knife back out of his pocket, and slashed her throat, just to make sure that she would bleed out. Once again, he ran back over to his bike, jumped on it, cycled over to his car, which was a few hundred meters away, and then he drove off into the night. He drove physically as far away from this crime scene as he could possibly get. I don't know how Jane was found. I don't know who found her, but we do know that it was literally within a few minutes of Jonathan Vass leaving. So they got there quite early, and I think she was still alive when paramedics actually managed to get to her in the car park. And of course, because this did take place in the car park of a hospital, they were able to rush Jane straight into the urgent care unit to be treated. And this was the part of the hospital that Jane actually worked in. The urgent care unit is where she worked. It's where all her friends worked. All of her best friends that she'd literally just been on a night out with were now the ones that were having to try and save her life. And all of these co-workers said that they didn't even recognise Jane at first. They just thought this was another patient being wheeled in. They couldn't tell that this was Jane because there was so much blood, so much swelling. Her body was practically mutilated to the point where she wasn't recognisable. The way that they identified who this was actually from her lanyard. She was wearing her little NHS badge that had her name on it, which of course was covered in blood. So her co-workers tried everything they possibly could to try to resuscitate and save Jane Clough, but sadly the blood loss was just so catastrophic. There was nothing they could do to save her. And so Jane Clough was pronounced dead by one of her friends in the hospital where she worked. Jane's autopsy revealed that she had been stabbed over 50 times by Jonathan Vass, 19 of which were in her neck alone. And your neck is such a small part of the body. Her jugular vein was completely severed, so there was pretty much no chance of her surviving this attack. Actually, the deepest wound that she'd sustained was about 13.5 centimetres deep, so she was losing a lot of blood very, very quickly. She had over 70 wounds in total. Like I said, 50 some of that were stab wounds, and then the rest of them were self-defense wounds all over her arms and her hands where she'd fought for her life. Following Jane's body being found in the car park, the whole of Blackpool's Victoria Hospital was put on lockdown because they had no idea what the circumstances of this murder had been. Of course, her friends had a pretty good idea of who had done this to her, but also it could have been anyone. It could have been a random madman outside, a serial killer on the loose. It could have been anything, and they had to protect everyone in the hospital. Jane Clough's parents were informed of her passing at midnight that same night, so just 4 hours after she died. And immediately, her parents, of course, they knew who had done this. There was no doubt about it. Of course, it was Jonathan Vass. And all of Jane's friends in the hospital said the exact same thing too. They knew exactly who had done this. They told the police to go and find Jonathan now, as quick as they possibly could, because also he had a child with Jane. So what is there to say that he's not going to try and kill his daughter as well? So police actually put 24-hour security on the Clough home. So that's Jane's parents, her mother and her father, but also her daughter. So they were under police protection as this manhunt for Jonathan Vass began. They had no idea where he was at this particular point in time. They just knew that he was probably in his car somewhere. He was probably still driving. So an alert was put out for his license plate. If anyone saw this license plate, they needed to get in contact with police. That night, because obviously Jonathan had murdered Jane in the evening around 8 o'clock, so all night into the early hours of the morning, Jonathan was just driving and driving and driving. I don't think he had a plan. I don't think he knew what he was going to do or where he was going to go. He was just driving. But then in the early hours of the morning, Jonathan Vass developed a plan. He had his next step in mind when he turned the car around and started heading back towards the Clough home, back to where his own daughter and Jane's parents were living. So he arrived at the home, he parked up his car, got out, went round to the boot, opened the boot, and he's doing something in the boot of his car. Meanwhile, he hasn't even noticed that there are literal armed police guards outside of the Clough house who have obviously seen Jonathan pull up and get out of his car. So immediately, 2 female police officers walked over to Jonathan Vass and arrested him, handcuffed him then and there for murdering his girlfriend, Jane Clough. And when he was arrested by these 2 women, Jonathan Vass just couldn't help himself but to throw some horrific sexist abuse at these women. Honestly, not surprised, considering how he's treated women through this whole case. It's obvious that he just doesn't value women. He doesn't see them as human beings. They are sex objects to him and literally nothing more. But anyway, as these women were arresting him behind his car, they looked into the boot to see what he was actually trying to do, because he was gonna get something out of there. And that was when they noticed his boot was full of jerry cans of petrol. It seemed that he was gonna try and continue this murder spree. I mean, we can only theorize what exactly he was going to do with them. Was he going to try and turn the car into a petrol bomb and try and kill himself in it and maybe blow something else up at the same time? Was he going to take all the jerry cans out and pour them all over the house and set the house on fire and kill Jane's parents and her daughter? We don't know who he was trying to kill or how he was going to try and kill them, but thank God he was stopped just before he managed to do it. If police hadn't put that 24-hour security on the Clough home, her family would have been dead as well. I have no doubt about that. So now they had him and they took him back to the police station for questioning. And he put on the most stern poker face you have ever seen in his interview. This man didn't have an ounce of sadness or guilt or remorse in his whole body. He didn't care. He was just sat there in the interview room, like leaning back, had his arms folded. He just really did not care that he was there. The only time he showed any emotion throughout this whole case was the times when his trial was mentioned, or his sentence, or jail, or anything like that. He wasn't sad that Jane was gone. He was sad that his life was over. He didn't care that hers was as well. So the trial began on October 7th, 2010, and Jane Clough, of course, because now she couldn't be used as a witness to testify in court, but luckily her diary could be used as evidence, and all of those entries that I read earlier on were again read in court, where she'd said things like, I can't help but think he'll get his revenge on me. I don't think we'll get to the trial without him doing something to hurt me before then. Especially that one particular quote where she said, I'm worrying today about Johnny coming to get me, even killing me. She knew that this was gonna happen. She knew that he was gonna come after her and that he was gonna murder her. She tried to tell people. She tried to tell the police. She tried to get him put away in prison, and she did everything she needed to do. He was in a holding cell, but that one judge that let him out on bail, that was the reason that Jonathan Vass was out on the streets and able to track her down and murder her. If he wasn't granted bail, Jane Clough would probably still be alive today. In this trial, Jonathan Vass pled guilty to Jane's murder. I mean, how could he not, really? And for that, he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years. Frustratingly, the rape charges that Jane filed while she was still alive, they were dropped. How and why, I have no idea. I know he's already serving life in prison, so it probably wasn't going to change anything about his sentence, but it would have been nice for Jane's family and for Jane, in memory of Jane, to get her some justice, to get him legally recognised as a rapist and as a sex offender. If not anything about Jane, but to protect women in the future. If he is ever let out of prison, he won't be considered a sex offender because he hasn't officially been found guilty of any sex crimes. And if he's not on the register, then that means that the earliest that he can be considered for parole is when he's 60 years old. So if he does get out age 60 and he's not a sex offender, that means that he won't have certain conditions on his release. If he was a sex offender, he wouldn't be allowed to go certain places between certain hours, do certain things. He would also be legally required to tell people he's a sex offender, I think. But because he was never tried for those charges, then he won't need to do any of that, which is really scary. It's really, really scary to think that this man could be out when he's 60 years old, just free to walk the earth. But hopefully he'll never be released anyway, because I mean, this is such a severe crime, and he has shown that he pays no attention to like probation rules and bail rules, so he probably will be in for the rest of his life, let's be honest. Since Jane Clough's murder, her family, specifically her mother and father, Penny and John, have campaigned tirelessly for change to bail laws primarily. Well, they've campaigned for so many different things, I'll get into them all, but their main thing that they wanted to do coming out of this case was change bail laws, because if Jonathan Vass had never been allowed out on bail, Jane wouldn't be dead. He wouldn't have been able to murder Jane. I honestly just can't believe how preventable this crime was. This is honestly one of the biggest emotional responses that I've ever had towards a case, and I think Jane's parents have done amazing to actually change the UK in her legacy. In 2012, Penny and John actually got a law passed called Jane's Law. And this law allows victims of rape to actually challenge bail decisions made by a judge. So if this law would have been a thing at the time of Jane's case, when Jonathan was allowed out on bail, Jane would have been allowed to contact the judge and say, "Hi, I don't feel safe after you've made this decision. Please can you reconsider the decision and maybe keep him in a holding cell?" It gives victims a voice. It gives victims a say in their own case. Her parents also became ambassadors for the National Stalking Advocacy Service, which is a campaign to create a register, kind of like the sex offenders register, but instead make it for stalkers and domestic abusers, which is probably one of the best ideas I've ever heard in my life. I can't believe that this isn't a thing. Penny and John have done so much for so many different causes and charities, different women's refuge charities, different domestic abuse charities. They just seem like amazing, amazing people. And I think you could even see that throughout the case, the way that they supported Jane through everything. I just think it's so nice to hear this at the end of such a tragic case, to hear that the victim's loved ones want to carry on that person's legacy in such a positive way. They want to create a positive outcome from what their loved one went through. Both of Jane's parents have actually been made MBEs for all the amazing work that they've done. Penny was made an MBE in 2013 and John joined her in 2018. But that is all I have on this case. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks again to Karma for sponsoring this video. Remember, if you want to download the app or the Chrome plugin, you can go through the link down below in the description. You need it, honestly. It'll make your online shopping life so much easier. Go save some money. Huge thank you to all of my channel members for helping me decide the cases that I cover, member, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can just click the join button on a desktop, or there'll be a link in the description of this video. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below because that would really help me out. If you want to subscribe, there'll be a link to do so right here. If you want to subscribe to my second channel, there'll be a link to do so right here. If you want to watch another true crime video, there'll be a playlist on the screen right now. Bye!